They say that form is temporary and class is permanent. Well, my guest this week is very much a class act. James Baker's career has encompassed every aspect of the TV business. Producer, broadcaster, senior executive and investor. Scripted and non-scripted, kids TV and documentary. He has experienced US corporate culture, succeeded in the world of the Murdochs at Sky, and thrived under German precision. James walks us through his fascinating career, gives us a sneak peek into his new ventures, and explains how Roland Rat helped to put him on the road to success. Enjoy. Hi James, welcome to the pod.
Thank you, Danny. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I usually start the podcast with a bit of a creative stimulus-like question, but your career is so unbelievably varied and we have so much ground to cover that I'm going to dispense with that and jump straight in. Just starting really with, how big a fan of TV were you when you were younger?
Well, I'm so old, Danny, that when I grew up, there were only, 3 channels. And actually, the main reason why I'm in television is because it's in the DNA. My father was at the BBC for over 50 years, and we actually grew up in television studios rather than watching television. So really, it was very much in the DNA. Actually, when I left school, I wanted to be a farmer, and my father rather patiently nodded and said, "That's great. Why don't you go and be a farmer then?" And I lasted about 3 months, and then came back and sort of went, "Well, what do I do now?" And I got a job as literally the post boy stroke runner at a fantastic place called TVAM, which launched in very early 1983 and was a real experiment in television in many ways. But on that first morning that it ever ran, I remember being in the studio at 5:30 in the morning, 6 in the morning. And it was an incredible thrill. And it was like being coming home. It was very, very weird. Being in a studio with a live show going on, however bad it was at that point, was an extraordinary experience. And that was it, really. I was sort of hooked.
So Andrew Neil talked about GB News recently and how terrible it was to launch. And I guess he had some other issues as well. But nevertheless, launching a new TV station is tough, right?
Completely. I mean, I would say the only exception of any TV station I can think of or major TV project was when The Big Breakfast launched. And I was lucky enough to be involved with that launch as well after TVAM finished and it lost its license. And with that exception, that was an absolute hit from the first day it started with Chris Evans. And aside from that, all of the other ones I've been involved with usually start in a relatively disastrous way because, you kind of think you absolutely know what's going to happen. And then, of course, you're completely wrong. And with TVAM, they all felt that breakfast television should be highly intellectual and you should wake up with a sort of Today Show Radio 4 style hit of intelligent stuff. And I remember that one of the first feature items was about female circumcision, which anyone could tell you that at sort of 7:10 on a Monday morning, having some people talking about the evils of female circumcision, however important it is, wasn't a good start to your day. I was lucky enough to be involved with TVO from birth to death. And it was great watching it find its feet as a, really popularist, rich and colourful and energetic morning show under Greg Dyke, when Greg Dyke came in. He was a brilliant boss for that term. So these things usually find their way as long as people are willing to change and be flexible.
And were you there when the Rat turned up?
I was the Rat's left arm, actually. I was still somewhere between being a runner and an assistant producer. And I got given the first Rat show to be an assistant producer on. And there was an extraordinary puppeteer called David Claridge who was the Rat. But he was the Rat. He lived and breathed being the Rat. So it was a bit like method acting. You didn't talk to David Claridge, you talked to the Rat. So we went out on tour all over Europe with the Rat. But at times, he said, listen, I can't do the bloody Rat and do the Rat's left arm. So can you just kind of waggle the left arm around while I do the rest of the Rat? So I did an awful lot of that. And an awful lot of of putting Roland away to bed at the end of the day. It was very important that Roland went into a special rat-shaped packing case at the end of the day. But no, again, amazing. My first experience of location shooting was kind of commando shooting Roland rat inserts in extraordinary bits of Europe, Rome and up the Alps and all kinds of extraordinary things in the back of a van.
So it sounds like you learnt quite a lot over that period of time. But then TVAM, as you say, did come to an end. And you mentioned the Big Breakfast. But your next, I suppose, big-ish move was into kids' TV with Nickelodeon. I don't know, had TVAM and the influence of Roland given you a particular love for kids' TV?
I think there was a bit of that. I think there were people at Nickelodeon at the time, and Nickelodeon was an amazing brand at that point. It was changing the way that kids' TV was produced in America in a really fundamental way. I mean, you had shows like Ren and Stimpy and Rugrats and shows that 5 years before, at the very most, you would have had some relatively tame cartoons and or Disney Club. And Nickelodeon comes along and does, does really revolutionary kinds of content with brilliant creative people. And I think they were more interested in the very little work that I'd done on the Big Breakfast that inevitably in any job interview you slightly inflate your influence on things. But I think they were most interested in how do you do things differently? How do you move children's television on from the BBC and from, the broom cupboard and from that and into something more anarchic and more headline grabbing and more exciting. And again, I think we were very lucky because we had some very good stuff coming from the States. We had not just animation, but some really great live action kids game shows, which really hadn't been around, and that changed, and stand up comedy and music. And so it felt very, very different. And we launched that in the UK and then launched it in Germany and in Australia and started sort of rolling it out.
And a good team at Nickelodeon at the time, right? I think people have gone on to great things.
Yeah, amazing team on both sides of the screen. I've been very lucky to have 3 really amazing woman bosses. In fact, 4 in total. But first of all, Anne Wood at TVM, who went on to create Teletubbies, was an amazing influence. And I was 18 and she was an amazing mentor. And then, at Nickelodeon, there was a woman who founded Nickelodeon called Jerry Laybourne, who came at it in a completely different way to the way in which most television executives would do. It wasn't, most TV was run by men at that point. It was, a lot of testosterone and a lot of this, that, and the other. And she was the absolute diametric opposite to that. And then I've worked with Liz Murdoch at Sky, and then finally with Dawn Airy at Sky. I think they all had a hugely positive effect on my education in television, my continuing education, and completely changed the way that I think about how to do business in a non-alpha male, non-challenging way. I think they're much more subtle, much better than a lot of other people I can think of. So I was very lucky to be able to work with them.
You had this JV in the UK with Sky and then ultimately moved over to Sky to become head of programming at Sky One and then controller of the channel. And it's interesting you talk about culture because Sky had quite a robust reputation in its early years. But over that period of time, I guess it was starting to be remodeled and reshaped by Liz Murdoch, amongst others. So what was Sky like over that period of time? Because you were there about 9-10 years.
It changed hugely. I know there were 1, 2, 3, 4 CEOs that I worked under at that point. As they went along, they were less and less testosterone fueled and old style TV. The first CEO was a guy called Sam Chisholm, who, there are books that could be written about Sam, who was a sort of shoe salesman from New Zealand and one of Rupert Murdoch's kind of key lieutenants at that time. He got brought in to really shake it up and to figure out really how to make money out of Sky. And he did an absolutely brilliant job, but he was about as aggressive as you get. I mean, if you were routinely fired at least every couple of months and then sort of recalled. And I think my first and almost worst experience of that was when very early on, we commissioned a show called Ibiza Uncovered, which at the time we didn't know it, but was quite a groundbreaking reality show. And it was due to go out at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. And we were all quite excited, although a bit scared, because it was edgy. It was properly edgy stuff. And it ran, and about sort of 10:57, my phone rings, and it's Sam basically going, you're getting fired, mate. It's a disgrace. I'm not having that kind of rubbish on this. Forgive me for those who say it's not a New Zealand accent. It's probably not. But so anyway, I kind of spent the night not sleeping, went into the office Monday morning, and the overnights came in about 11:15. And of course, it had done huge numbers. So I get a call from Sam about 10 minutes later going, mate, fantastic work. Let's do another series. And where else can we do Uncovered? Anyone, you ask anyone who worked with Sam, it was sort of, you were waiting for the call from Sam. I mean, I spent most of my time working with Liz, who, as you saw, went on to do amazing things with Shine and NMR Shine Group and all of that. And, she was a natural. She absolutely was and is a natural at not only the business of television, but at managing people and encouraging people and empowering people. Right at the beginning, there were very few production companies who would work with us. A lot of them were pretty snobby about Sky, and that we rang them up and said, hey, we've got some commission we want to do. We got some slots. Can we come and talk to you about them? And they were like, yeah, no, we only work for terrestrial. No. So, and the people who were the most open to working with us, funny enough, were Granada, LWT Granada, with a bunch of people who've gone on, the Nigel Lithgows of this world, Simon Chaps, who was very involved at that point, a load of really, John K. Cooper, and they came in and they pitched us a whole evening schedule of shows. They took us to LWT. They did a brilliant American pitch, and it beats Uncovered, and I think a couple of other shows came out of that, because they basically said, 10 o'clock Sunday night, you could do this amazing show, and pitched it brilliantly, and that that made a huge difference. So I don't think it was, for me, it was, if you work with, and I believe this religiously, is if you work with great people, that's what you need to be doing. Work with people who really know what they're doing and are experts, and don't pretend that you know everything. Just make sure you connect up with the people like that. And I thought they did a really amazing job with those kinds of shows.
And one of the other things that you did in that period of time was have the opportunity to do some executive study over at Harvard. And that's a fantastic opportunity. Was that also incredibly helpful from a career point of view?
Yeah, I think, and I was, very grateful to Dawn Airy, who previously done it. And when she was saying, well, where do you want to go with your career next? And I went, well, I'd love to learn more about the business rather than just the channel side. And she went, well, we will send you to Harvard, which was, an extraordinary experience for anybody at any point. And I think other than learning an awful lot, I think what it taught me is that the vast majority of people in the TV business at that point, and I still think it's probably true, are sheltered and shielded from the actual business of television. They're given a budget, or they're given a kind of range, or they're given targets, but they never really get to see a P&L. They never really get to see cash flow forecasts. They never get to see, to me, the real guts of all of these businesses, which is, how do you actually make money in this business? And I think that, people tended to sort of not want to show us. And very, very rarely at Sky did the finance guys ever say, come and have a look and we'll show you how much money you're making or not making and whatever. They just said, here's your budget. So I think for me, it was a very good moment in my career to learn about areas I knew very little about. And it gave me the opportunity then to go on and work with Fleming Family Partners, who are a absolutely fantastic private office and private bank and investment operation, who wanted to explore what content and IP meant in the investment space. So that allowed me to get into that space and learn a whole stack of stuff about, again, the real nuts and bolts of the business of the media and content industry.
And there was a stint at Current TV as well.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of, had the opportunity to mix and match a bit, and Current came along, a bit like all these other, new launches. I'm a sucker for new launches. If something new comes along, it's the new shiny thing. And you kind of don't say no to Al Gore when Al Gore sort of comes along and goes, hey, we've got this US and we want to launch it and internationally, and how about it? You kind of go, well, yeah, all right. Yeah, that would be amazing.
Your next move was to Red Arrow. What was the brief when you joined?
The first discussion, I was working with a very dear friend and colleague, Joel Denton, who's another one who's been in the business for ages and knows a huge amount about how the business runs. And Joel sort of said, listen, I'm talking to ProSieben and to Jan Froman, who was at ProSieben, about growing a new production distribution group, and they're looking for UK companies to invest in. Do you want to have a session with Jan? And we kind of sat down, and the brief was, we're looking for early stage companies that have got good growth potential, that are creative led, and that we can leave alone to do their growing, but benefit from the sort of group effect of ideas that we can then flow into the group. And Jan Froman, who he was my last sort of proper boss, and couldn't have had a better boss, more hands-off but inspirational in understanding the business. He came from a private equity background, so he really understood the guts of how do you make businesses really tick. But he also had the flexibility to allow people to have the creative freedom to try stuff. And without that creative freedom, and without it's this whole thing, I think, of fear, is if you take fear out of the creative process, you've got a much better chance of doing business than if people are fearful. And I think fear is one of the great killers of creativity. If you're looking over your shoulder the whole time and going, well, I can't do that because I might lose my job, it's hopeless. And Jan was always very open and said, listen, just go and try stuff. And he gave that brief to the companies we invested in. And over time, I got more involved in the central process of developing Red Arrow and building new companies in the US and new companies in Europe.
And part of Red Arrow UK became CPL and League of Their Own, which must have been an enormous joy to have been a part of, because it's become quite iconic.
Daniel Lux and Murray Bolland at CPL have a very specific way of developing shows, very, very clinical way of thinking about how shows go together. And watching League of Their Own, I mean, they kind of already got started with League of Their Own, but watching the sort of juggernaut that became was very exciting. It was a great show with, again, amazing talent. We had Danielle and Murray at CPL in the scripted space working with Hilary Bevan-Jones, who is a pretty legendary drama figure and over the years has done amazing stuff. Was a great experience, again, because however much you commission drama shows, or even semi-involved with commissioning, until you actually sit down with producers and understand the guts of it, you haven't got a clue. And Hilary, to me, is one of the really great producers in the business. It has been and was a great experience throughout.
So you've now launched Silberhorn Media Capital. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, Silberhorn was a sort of natural evolution from all of the experience that I had at Red Arrow. We kept thinking, how is the investment side of the business going to change? And with Silberhorn, it's just provided me with an opportunity to think about how new forms of investment can be applied to the content space. And I would go beyond the content space. I think it's sort of talent, IP, and its relation to content. I think it's a strange triangle, and I haven't drawn it yet. But I think more than ever, talent of all kinds is the key driver, especially with the growth of influencers and social media, is the impact that a single major influencer can have on a brand or on a piece of content is so huge and is so powerful, put up against traditional forms of marketing, that you have to factor them into how you involve that whole process in the creation of content and the marketing of content. But I mean, more specifically, I think that freedom and the ability to engage with those kinds of people means that you can change the economics of how content is financed. Because if you can say, well, we're going to work with this person who's got 20 million followers and this person who's got 30 million, and we're basically going to evolve the crowdfunding notion into a smart way of using NFTs to basically finance content in the future, then I think there's, in certain segments and in certain areas, I think funding outside of the traditional methods is going to become more and more prevalent, using NFTs and blockchain to manage the process of how you deal with those rights and those slices. It's somewhere between scary and incredibly exciting. But I think with the right IP and with the right talent, you can do that. And that changes the food chain completely, because if you can go direct to customer with content that you've self-funded, then you're cutting out those middlemen. And there are plenty of ways to platform your content and monetize that content. So I think that's a very exciting notion, but I think it will really change the way the business runs again in the next 5 years. I don't think the landscape is going to look remotely like the landscape is now in 5 years' time.
And it's interesting that because the UK has been a bit of a hotbed of indies launching and them being subsumed into bigger businesses, and a lot of that was predicated on rights and control of IP over periods of time. But in a world where there are these new forms of funding available, but also in a world where back-end net profits sort of disappear a little bit if you're doing deals with streaming services who are a much bigger part of the landscape. And so the long-term value of the indies changes, and maybe Channel 4 gets privatized in the UK, and therefore that changes the dynamics as well. So do you see a very different world that we end up in on the business side of the UK TV industry?
Yeah, I think both the business side and the creative side. And one of the reasons we're just launching a content business called Anyway with Sam Parker and Ollie Parker, who've got amazing experience in the film industry and in the commercial side of the business, both creative and sales, is because we think there's a sort of post-COVID, post-platform model that's starting to emerge. And we're as much focused on building creative partnerships as building new commercial models, whether that is looking at NFT funding, whether that's looking at building slates of content where you do extra privately financed slates of content and retain those rights, rather than going, oh God, I hope you sell it to Netflix or Amazon. I don't think that's sustainable. I think your margins are going to get squeezed. You've got to somehow end up with some kind of ownership of rights. But I don't think that needs to sit in a traditional company. I think it's a bit like having a kind of stock market portfolio. If you partner in a stack of different things and you put your money in here, there, and everywhere, and you find new ways of funding it, I don't mind if I own 20% of a really valuable bit of IP that's got long-term potential. I'm fine with that. I want to build a portfolio that could at one end be animation, at the other end be feature film. And it means that the slate that we're building has got, real breadth, very, very focused on international, and very focused on thinking of new ways to look at how you can finance that content, rather than just we've come up with an idea, now let's go and try and sell it. I'm not saying we won't do that. I mean, we will always be very happy to sell content to traditional users, but I'm just as interested in the emerging models and how they develop.
What would you pick as a career highlight if you had to cast your mind back, and maybe something you tell the grandkids, I don't know, but something you think, yeah, that really helps to define me as James Baker, the TV executive?
I think other than being Ronan Rat's left arm, that's pretty unbeatable. At Sky, we had a brief flirtation. I know they've done a lot more, but around 2000, we had a flirtation with the movie business. And we started something called Sky Pictures, and we invested in some in some movies. Not many, but we invested in a movie called Saving Grace that was fabulous. Brenda Blethyn sort of dope comedy set in Cornwall, which nobody had any expectations about. We sort of ran out of money, and therefore the ending's a bit quick. And we kind of thought, well, it's lovely. And Martin Clunes was in it, and he played this character called Doc Martin in it, who everyone thought, well, he was brilliant. He was hilarious. And he was a local doctor who would like to get stoned. And we all kind of thought, this is lovely. And then it just caught light a bit. And I remember, I was lucky enough to go with Liz to Sundance, and it went to Sundance because that's where we were going to try and sell it. And it got onto the sort of audience, the main cinema audience competition. And it won the audience award, which was probably the first and only time I could sit there and actually go, oh my God, I won something. But it was that amazing experience when you've made, or you've been involved in making something. I can't pretend to have made it, but I was involved in getting it made. And sitting in that cinema and people standing up and going, we loved it, for all of its flaws. We loved it. And then it being a success, and it in turn creating Doc Martin and, creating a whole new set of sort of IP out of that. So I can't pretend I was anything other than an executive on it, rather than anything more special. But that was a very special sort of moment for me. And it was the moment where business and creativity come together, and where you can go, not only have we created something that's fun and great, but it makes money. And it was a good thing, and it ticked all those boxes. So, that was just one. There've been many, but that was a lovely experience.
Well, this is the part of the podcast where I ask my guest for their lockdown film, book, music choice, and box set. So, picking one from each, which of those would get you through the next lockdown if hopefully it never happens, but possibly maybe around the corner?
Yeah. Well, a film would definitely be Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but mainly because of a guy called William Goldman, who wrote the screenplay and
no relation.
And he wrote a brilliant book called Adventures in the Screen Trade, which was the first book I got given when I was at TAM when I was 18. It got given to me by a film producer who went, before you do anything else, make sure you read Variety and the Hollywood Reporter and read this book. And it does brilliantly. It's brilliantly written, but it ends up saying what you need to understand is really honestly, nobody knows anything. And that was the first and best lesson. And I was talking to a 15-year-old filmmaker who sort of went, oh, I really like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And I went, great, go and read William Goldman's book, because it may have been written in 1982, but it is as real now as it was back then, to the extent that no one's got a bloody clue what's going on. So that's the book. That's the film. It may be the book as well. That's the film. I think the book weirdly is a book that I briefly thought I was a writer when I was about 21, and I started writing a screenplay for a John Fowles book called The Magus, because I fell very in love with it and the whole notion of it. And I remember sort of writing at least 40 pages and then getting in touch with the literary agent and going, I'm writing this film, is it all right if I make it? It kind of went, well, actually, Mr. Fowles has no interest in this film being made, and who are you, by the way? So I didn't, but I go back to John Fowles' The Magus on a pretty regular basis. I think it's an amazing book, and I'm really excited to see that it's being made into a big premium TV series now. So I cannot wait to see that. So that's the book. Weirdly, the box set is Friends. I think if you watch the evolution of an extraordinary piece of IP and talent colliding, I think Friends is a perfect example of that. I think it is. If you watch the arc of the characters, the development of the stories, the richness of it as it gets more and more popular, the ultimate sort of collapse of it, it's a soap opera in its own right, and I think you can dip in and out at any point. It's very interesting. My kids, who are in their early 20s, they watch it quite happily, and they're both, God help me, they're both in the television industry as well, so there's no escape. But they go back to that as their sort of lockdown comfort TV show, and I think it's one of the few ever made. So 10 seasons, an awful lot of episodes. That would do me for a long time.
And can I just ask, were you at Sky when Sky bought into the Friends franchise?
I think at the time I was lucky enough to be head of Sky One, so I could sit there and bask and go, look, oh no, clever. But I'm the person who sat at the LA screenings watching Lost and Desperate Housewives and going, don't get it, no idea, why would I want to buy that? So my reputation as a hit maker is, low to non-existent, I think, in that way. Music, I'm a enormous and very long-term Neil Young fan, and I've listened to Neil Young since I was about 6. And the sort of very early Neil Young, there's a sort of period of Neil Young between about 1970 and 74 that I'm, in a slightly nerdy way, that's the Neil Young that I love. So there's an album that he made called On the Beach, which is one of his least popular and most morose that I absolutely love. So I would probably take, if I couldn't take a Neil Young box set of that period, I would probably take On the Beach by Neil Young.
Fantastic. Well, James Baker, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. It's been great. And we'll look forward to this interesting world of the way that TV can be funded in the future. And perhaps if you do return to screenwriting, you can follow the trend that was established in the past with the movie My Left Foot and bring us My Left Arm.
I'll be working on it. Thank you very much.